Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 223, I chat with Mark Waldrep of AIX Records about the high-resolution audio experiment we're conducting on AVS Forum. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded September 6th, 2014. Episode 223, the AVS AIX High-Res Audio Experiment. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of AVSforum.com. This week's guest geek is Mark Waldrep, founder and chief engineer of AIX Records, and a regular guest on the show who I'm happy to welcome back. Hey, Mark.
How are you, Scott? Happy. Should I say Saturday? I can't say Saturday. We're not on
No, you can say Saturday.
Can I say happy Saturday?
You can, in fact, say happy Saturday. So for everybody out there, we're recording this on Saturday because next week, next Thursday at our regularly scheduled time, I will be out at CEDIA, the big trade show, on that Thursday, scouring the show floor for interesting news. So we thought we would pre-record this show, and it'll air on Thursday at its normal time. But we always want to give you new and interesting content. So here it is. Let me first say that those of you who are tuned in live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room there or at irc.twit.tv can post questions as we go, and I'll pass along as many as I can. So the reason I have Mark on today is that it's been now at least a couple of months that we have been running an experiment on AVS Forum regarding high-resolution audio, which, Mark, you're obviously a big proponent of. You record everything in high-resolution audio yourself, and you've got quite a catalog of titles. But the big question that I think you and I both are interested in is how much does high-resolution audio improve the sound? Can people hear it, the difference, obviously, or is it only a very subtle difference? So tell me about how the experiment came to be. What you and I started talking, but I don't want to be the one talking here. I'd rather let you be doing the talking. So give us a little history of this experiment, how it got started, and what we wanted to investigate and how we set it up.
Sure. I peruse, various websites, and with the emergence of high-res audio as being sort of a topic these days, it's going to be featured at the AES convention in a couple of weeks, and it was a big event last summer during CE Week that I know you were aware of and participated in. It's always been argued in these various tests that people do. I was in touch with a guy in Barcelona that was putting on a test, and I wrote back to these people, including the big Meyer and Moran AES paper, stating that, well, you really have to have raw material. The stuff that you're evaluating as to whether it is perceptibly different than a standard CD, if it was a high-res file, has to actually contain content that exceeds that of a traditional CD. And the Meyer and Moran study was completely useless because it didn't. All of the files, all of the CDs, SACDs, DVD audio, real-time down conversion to 44.1 was done on content that came from analog tapes and from other sources that didn't contain any additional dynamic range or frequency response than a standard CD. So how can you test for something that doesn't exist?
And what was very interesting about that Myers and Moran test, just let me interject here, is that they concluded that there was no significant perceptible difference between high-res audio and CD audio, which of course they would, and they used a number of people coming in and out, but I think the general conclusion would have been reached since there was no truly high-resolution content in the stuff they were playing.
Exactly. I mean, that's the point, is people, pushed that article quite heavily, and even the AES published it in their journal, and it's been, quoted many, many times as, well, this is proof positive that high-resolution music doesn't matter. Why are we going to all the time in trouble to try and record with higher sample rates and longer word lengths? I mean, they're not alone in that, but I see enough of that quote. So I was very curious. In fact, I was in touch with one of the researchers at the time, and I asked him, well, what did you play? Well, what was the content that you actually played for your assembled group there, the people that were part of the Boston Audio Society and so forth? And the fact came back that the list, which you can see online now, and you and I have communicated about it, it's all, Elton John and a number of chess key records done in SACD. And there's only one DVD audio in there, I think, actually something capable at 9624. I can't remember exactly which one. I think it was maybe a Steely Dan record. But all of them were well contained within the parameters, the specifications of a compact disc. So if you're testing something that starts as a compact disc fidelity and then is down converted to CD quality, how are you expected to have any difference? So that kind of, it seems no brainer, but people still argue about it. So, I'm not here to advocate that one way or the other is the right way, but I know that we aren't testing the right things until we come up with a rigorous test that starts and proves. I'm sitting in a room where I hope to have some speakers from my friends out at JBL and Harman, reference monitors now that go up to 40K, and amplification and a complete chain from the sources, my sources and others, where I can play for people in here in stereo or into surround, material that I can measure with a microphone in here that exceeds a CD. If we can do that, then we've at least got a start for the test, and the procedures for that test will have to be worked out. But that's part of what I'm trying to push for is a rigorous, scientifically valid test that really sets the stage for answering the question: can we or can we not perceive as human beings the sound difference between a compact disc and a 96 kilohertz 24-bit high-resolution version of the same exact file, not something that's been remastered, the very same file. And that's where you and I got talking, saying, well, I do have content that qualifies. Why don't we try a casual test? And I will prepare those files. I'll take the 9624s and down convert them, and we'll seemingly qualify people for high-resolution systems and see whether people can tell the difference. And I did the test myself, and we can talk about some of the results that came along, but I believe that there is a benefit, whether it's obvious, whether it's subtle. I think it's on the margins, but given that we have hardware and playback formats that can contain at least 9624, and I think that's enough actually, then we can more accurately reproduce what was in the room at the time the musicians were playing.
I should point out that there are really two parameters that can exceed the capabilities of CD. One is frequency response, and that is particularly the high frequencies. How high a frequency can you record and reproduce? And with a CD, it's pretty well stuck at 20 kilohertz, which is the traditional upper limit of human hearing. And as we age, certainly that diminishes. And I'm sure, Mark, you and I both can't hear 20K right now at our age. But there is content up above 20K in things like cymbals and many different instruments. And aside from frequency extension, the other thing that is important here is dynamic range. And that is the difference between the softest sound, essentially zero, and the loudest sound that can be reproduced. And that is determined by the bit depth. I should say also that the frequency response is determined by the sampling frequency or the sampling rate. So on CDs, it's 44,100 times per second that a sample is made. And that determines the frequency response. And basically, the frequency response is half the sampling rate. It's called the Nyquist frequency. So with a 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate, you can't get above 22.05 kilohertz in audio frequencies. And, we kind of round that down to 20. With 96 kilohertz sampling rate, which is what Mark uses, you can record things up to 48 kilohertz. Now, no one can hear that directly, but does it have an effect on frequencies in the audible range. That is part of the question we're trying to address. Now, dynamic range is determined by bit depth or word length. CDs use 16-bit words, and they get the maximum possible dynamic range is something like 90, well, theoretically it's 96 dB, but given what you have to do to make a CD, it comes out, practically speaking, to be like 93. With 24 bits, you can actually exceed that by quite a bit. And the human capability is something on the order of 120, 130 dB, Mark. Have I got that right?
About 130 dB. More than that, your ears start bleeding.
Yeah, exactly. So the question then becomes, can that extra information, that ultrasonic information above 20 kilohertz and the dynamic range beyond 90-some dB, can that make a difference in what you hear? Now, not only do you have to record it with higher sampling rates and bit depths, but you have to be able to play it, but you have to have a system on which you can play it back that can reproduce the ultrasonics and the wide dynamic range. And most consumer systems, certainly low-cost systems, can't do it. And in order to be able to get a system to do it, you've got to spend some serious money. So as a result, we divided this test into two parts. And I posted these files, and I said, anybody can listen to these files and send me their results. We're going to tell you exactly what that entailed. But you also have to send me the components in your system. You know, what are you using to play it? What's the amplifier? What are the speakers? And so on. And then I went and I looked them all up. And I looked up the manufacturer's specs. And I wanted to see if their systems were truly capable of reproducing this extra information. So I divided the respondent group into two parts: those who have high-resolution audio-capable systems and those who don't. So, Mark, let's get back to the setup here. We chose 3 of your tracks that you had recorded that we could verify had ultrasonic information and wide dynamic range as well. And we've got actually the spectrograms. You took spectrograms of these 3 tracks that were from different artists, different styles. And let's take a look at we have the graphics of those, where we can see JMI, for example, Just My Imagination, which was from Wallace Roney, I believe, right?
That's right, yeah.
And so tell us what we're seeing here.
Well, that's why I say I talked about how to read spectrographs on my blog a while back. But essentially, you've got 3 graphs. In the upper left-hand corner of the graph is the traditional time versus amplitude graph, which shows the contour of the dynamics, how loud things are given any moment in time. And then below that is a different way of displaying the information. This is a spectrograph that actually shows the time from left to right and the frequency in the y axis. And then depending on the color, brighter colors, reds and yellows and oranges and so forth, which you see down below, are greater amplitude, and those fall off into purples or through blue and into purple as it rises into higher and higher frequencies. And the scale on the right, I can't see exactly what that is, but I know that it goes out to 48,000 cycles per second. So a CD would be half of that in height. And you can see that there's a lot of information that's sonically being produced by that ensemble, Harman muted trumpet, for instance, and cymbals and some of the things you mentioned, contribute to the overall sound. Over on the right-hand side, where I've graphed the average, I took the entire piece and said, okay, let me know what kind of frequency content is in this piece from the first moment to the end. And you see the red line, which continues out to 48 kilohertz. And then the yellow line. The yellow line is the 44/116-bit. Now, they're essentially identical up until that 20 kilohertz, where the roll-off that's built into the DACs and into the reproduction process takes over and says, well, I got to get out of here if you're a CD, because anything you present higher than that's going to alias and fold over and create some artifacts that aren't really part of the recording. So that's the dramatic difference, at least from a science perspective, from an acoustics perspective. The question is, does that red line, as it exceeds 20 kilohertz, have any impact on what we hear? This is the frequency side of things. We don't have in this graph, you don't see the dynamic range, the small letters in the lower right-hand side where you can do the same kind of thing against amplitude. Will show you what the peak value was and what the RMS value was, what the dynamic range that's possible, what the dynamic range that was used actually comes out to. A lot of people cheat in that area by they fade the tune out to 0 and call that the lowest part of the dynamic range. You need to fade out to the room ambience in the recording space to get a real handle on what dynamic range can be. And it's not unusual. Look, even my recordings, it's really unusual to get dynamic range that exceeds that 93 dB. But the theoretical limit for moving from a CD or 16 bits up to that 24-bit word length is, I think, valuable, because we now have that much more room as engineers to produce, to record, and process the files, which usually end up be less than 16 bits wide when you get them. But because watching a meter during recording, you never know how loud somebody's going to get on the spur of the moment. And if they exceed that 16 bits, you've just lost it. With 24 bits, you get an additional dynamic range during the capture phase and during the post-production phase of that recording.
So I should make sure that everybody understands that we took these 3 files. They were 3 songs, and you provided complete tracks, which I thought was quite generous and very good, because it gave people a chance to hear the entire song. We have Just Your Imagination from Wallace Roney, who's a trumpet player, and it's all done in Harmon mute, which has a lot of very high-frequency information. A tune called Mosaic from Lawrence Juber, I believe, right? Guitar player.
Right. Yep.
And then On the Street Where You Live, which is sung by Steve Torme, Mel Torme's son, with a complete big band behind him. And we took those 3 tracks, which, as you could see on that graph there, we verified had ultrasonic information and wide dynamic range. And then, Mark, you took them and took a copy of each one and basically sample rate converted it down to 16 bits, 44.1, the same as CD.
That's true. And I used a software sample rate conversion program called Process, which is a professional tool that's used by people in the industry that do mastering to get from one sample rate to another. There are a variety of ways that you can do that sample rate conversion. This one was part of the Sonic Solutions pre-mastering system that I've had for years, and now that Sonic Studio does it, it's actually a separate application that can work in a batch format. But it's quite good. I mean, it's what the professionals use to make these kinds of conversions from, in this case, a non-integer multiple. We're going from 96 to 44.1. On my website over at the blog, I've done that every possible permutation from 96 to 44.1. Let people hear whether they can see that or hear the difference between different types of sample rate conversion. It's very subtle, but I used one that is typically used with rectangular and certain kind of dither and so forth to get to 44.1. Then, right, as you pointed out, we had a problem. We got to get back to 96 so that people will know or won't be able to tell from the file size and from the sample rate which one was which, so that they would end up to be the same size, even though half of the file now is dead silence.
Right, exactly. So we had to then re-up-convert back to 2496, and there would be no extra information introduced above 20 kilohertz or beyond 90 dB dynamic range, 93 or so. But we had to put it in a 2496 container, if you will, so that when I present these 2 files to people and label them A and B, and I don't tell them which is which, then they won't be able to just look in their computer in the Finder on Mac or whatever and say, oh, this file's smaller, so it's obviously the down converted one. It's so many megabytes fewer than the other one. So they're exactly the same size in terms of megabytes. They are you can't tell just by casually looking at the files in the Finder or the Windows Explorer or whatever. that they're any different. And they're labeled the same. It's just my imagination A, just my imagination B, mosaic A, mosaic B, on the street where you live A, on the street where you live B. And I put them on the website, and I said to people, okay, download them, play them. Can you tell me which is high res? Now, it was interesting. This was a kind of an interesting approach because it was not the classic ABX blind testing. It's a blind test because you don't know which is which. But Mark, do you have a handle on the difference between AB and ABX?
Well, you know that there are only two states, AB. In ABX, the choice between those two is not handled by the listener. You're simply being delivered files in a random way. Even the giver doesn't know what they are. So it's completely blind. ABX is a methodology. There are programs and researchers use specialized equipment that allows you simply to direct one towards the listener and another one towards the listener, and nobody knows which one is which.
But that's not exactly what we wanted to do, because my understanding of ABX is you have an A and you have a B, and one of them is played to you. You don't know which one. And then the other one is played, and they're played back and forth, and you have to say, can you hear a difference? Can you identify whether X is A or B? What I really wanted to do here is to say which one is the high resolution, not is there a difference you can hear and reliably identify, but which one is in fact high resolution. So I simply said, okay, I'm just going to present A and B. People can play them any way they want. They're disguised, they're camouflaged, as we discussed, and they should be able to just play them and be able to say or not whether or not A or B is high resolution. Now, I was the one that chose which one of each track, which version of each track was high resolution and which one was down converted, by using actually a website called random.org, which generates random numbers not based on a random number generation algorithm, which is only pseudo-random, but it actually uses atmospheric noise to create truly random numbers. And the way I did it, for those of you who might be interested, is I set the range of random numbers from 1 to 100. And I said, okay, generate a random number. If it came up even, then A was going to be the high resolution. If it came up odd, then B was going to be the high resolution, or vice versa. I forget exactly which. But I thought that was sufficiently random to allow this test to proceed. So I posted them on the website, and people started downloading them. And I invited them to listen and then send me, as I said before, their results. Which one did they think was high-res, true, native high resolution, A or B? And they also were supposed to send me their systems so I could categorize them, whether they were listening on a high-res system or a non-high-res system. And this was kind of an interesting exercise in and of itself. Mark, I sent you the results, and you saw that in some cases, some people had some very sophisticated, very capable components in their system, but maybe one component in the system was limited to 20 kilohertz. Typically, it might have been the speaker. And in that case, that's a bottleneck. Even if the rest of the system can reproduce the greater amount of information, it's not going to get through to your ears if any one piece of the equipment chain, the signal chain, is not capable of reproducing that extra information. So I found that to be kind of interesting.
And it's actually worse than that, because as there was an article that John, my friend from Benchmark, John Seow, wrote, in which each component in the chain, if it's at all lacking or limited, even if it makes to 20 kilohertz, it might be down 2 dB at 30 kilohertz and down 4 dB by the time it gets to 40. They compound so that every component will add to that diminution, to that reduction in fidelity or high frequency response in this case as you go through each piece. So if you've got a receiver that's down 2 dB and then a player that's down 2 dB and a DAC or a speaker that's down 2 dB, they add 2, 4, 6, 8 dB day down at 40 kilohertz, and 8 dB down is a lot.
Yes.
A very large amount.
Yep, exactly right. Before we continue, F-Loop in the chat room has a question. What is your theory regarding the potential audibility of frequencies above 20K or 22K, as he says here? Is it due to intermodulation products generated in the ear or perhaps in the transducer, the speaker element? Or can we actually hear content above 20 kilohertz? Or is it something else?
We don't
really know, do we?
We don't really know. That's part of what the test is about. There's some people say that it's one thing. The intermodulation distortion is certainly one that is commonly referred to. And, I've gotten up in front of people and said, I really don't care what the reason is or what the exact mechanism at this point. I think further research, and those are people that have access to some equipment. I talked to the Kalman Rubinson, who's a medical doctor and has access to MRI machines. It might be interesting to see whether your brain is actually triggering on something that you don't even know consciously is happening, and therefore can get some kind of perception. Yeah. I'm just comfortable that for the first time with the equipment and for the delivery formats as well, we can deliver things that match the capabilities of your human ears.
Right. Now, Lazy Thin Man in the chat room is bringing up a point that was my next point to bring up anyway, which is we are going on faith that no one in the test who has submitted their results to us are cheating. And he's right, which is one of the several reasons that I have reiterated time and time again. This is not, I repeat, not a scientific test. As you said at the beginning, Mark, it's a casual test. It's what I think is a fun and interesting experiment to allow people who are interested in this subject to examine, to explore, to investigate the whole notion of high-res audio and how important is it to them. If they can't hear a difference, then it's not important. If they can, then maybe it is. And it all depends on your system, or a lot of it depends on your system. But there are several reasons why this is not a scientific test, and I want to make sure we understand that. For example, we are conducting this experiment in uncontrolled conditions. Everybody has their own system. They have them in different rooms, which might have an impact. We are relying on participant honesty, that they didn't cheat, that they didn't, for example, open these files up in a computer with a program that allows them to see the spectrogram that we just showed and say, oh, well, that one's obviously, 2496. So, we are relying on people's honesty for that. Also, the task sample is too small. We're only giving them 3 things to identify. And the probability that someone might guess all 3 correct is over 12%. It's 1 in 8. So, this is not plus the fact that we haven't got enough participants for a statistically significant result. So, these are all examples of why this isn't a scientific test. I still think it's worth doing because it's, as I said, it was intended to provide a fun and interesting way for AVS members to explore the efficacy of high-resolution audio for themselves and to collect some data from this activity just out of curiosity. What might it reveal, and how might it inform future investigations and experiments? And we're going to talk about what we might do in the future a little later. So as long as everybody understands that we're not claiming this is scientific, it's just interesting, and it might very well lead to something more rigorous, and it might tell us something interesting. And in fact, I think it actually does. So, which brings us to the results, which I've been gathering for the last couple of months, putting them in these 2 spreadsheets, divided between high-res audio systems, people with those, and people without, with regular non-high-res audio systems. And we came up with a couple of interesting things. For example, overall, of the people who have high-res audio systems, verifiable high-res audio systems, I took an average of the number of correct responses. Some people got all 3 right, some got 2 right, some got 1 right. None of those people in that sample who have the true high-res systems, none of them got 0 correct. And the average accuracy was right around 80%. Now, here's the respondent accuracy, if you're watching the video. Among the non-high-res audio systems, their accuracy was right around 50%. So right there, that's kind of interesting. 50% is generally, assigned to random chance. 80% is quite a bit more than that. Now, let's take a look at this respondent accuracy chart here. Notice that the red bars are from those who have non-high-res audio systems, and I charted the number of correct responses, or the correct identifications. ND, the one on the very left there, is 4 people among this group said, I couldn't hear any difference whatsoever on any of them. None of them. So, 4 people out of, I believe it was 30 some. Let me quickly look here. Yeah, I think it's 33, 36. Unfortunately, I have the wrong one in front of me. I don't see the total number. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's in the 30s. It's in the mid-30s. We have a total of 56 respondents. 23, I think, high-res, and 33 non-high-res, so 56. That's what it is. So going back to that chart, we can see that 4 people said, I can't hear a difference. 4 people got 0 correct. They made their guesses and got none right. 11 people got 1 right. 9 people got 2 right, and looks like 5 people got all 3 right. Kind of forms a bell curve. But then we look at the blue bars, and these are the people who have high-res audio systems. And, 3 people got 1 right, 8 people got 2 right, and 12 people got all 3 right. Mark, what do you think about when you see this particular result?
I think it's actually very interesting, and while I wouldn't say it's compelling, it's certainly interesting. I think another facet of those people that are doing better and getting 3 out of 3 and so forth is that the people with the high-res capable systems may have in their personal listening be more of an audiophile because they've invested more money in this and therefore have a greater acuity for hearing the differences and some of the descriptions that I read in the spreadsheets that you sent over previously seem to indicate to me that these people are more seasoned listeners and therefore may have some skills that if they were put onto a non-high-res system, we'd see how they would fare. But I'm not surprised, but I'm not ready to start waving the flags either.
Well, as I said, this is a non-scientific experiment. It's just to see what we might learn from this. And it's true that the people with the I think your point, I was trying to remember what you just said, and because I was looking at the chat room too, listener acuity and training skill is very, very important here. 2 weeks ago, I had on the podcast John Iverson, who is the web monkey for Stereophile, among many others, and he's also himself an audiophile. And he was arguing that double-blind testing or blind testing in general really has more to do with testing the skill of the listener rather than what differences there might be between 2 pieces of equipment he was talking about primarily, or 2 files, as in this case. As opposed to, he gave the example of medical double-blind tests, where you take a drug or you take a placebo sugar pill, and you see which one has more effect. That has nothing to do with skill. That's just the body responding to a chemical that you have no control over. But listening is a skill, and it can be learned, and it can be taught, and it can be developed. Philips has a website called Golden Ears that is a training program, actually, that helps you develop your listening skills. Harman has a similar thing that's available. And so this may be something that part of what we're seeing here in these results is listener skill. And as you say, those who have invested a bunch of money in their equipment are more likely to be more careful, more skilled listeners, perhaps, than those who don't. Anyway, the other thing that I thought was interesting was taking a look at the accuracy of identification by track. Because we have these 3 tracks, Just My Imagination, Mosaic, and On the Street Where You Live. And we actually have a graph here showing the accuracy that everybody got for each track. And if we can take a look at that, we will see, as soon as we can pull it up here, there it is, that Mosaic, the guitar track, it's guitar and some other instruments, as I recall, was correctly identified more often by both those with high-resolution audio and non-high-resolution audio systems. And Just My Imagination was the lowest accuracy score among both. But again, we see that the high-res audio systems, people with high-res audio systems, got the correct response much more often than the non-high-res, although they both follow a very similar curve. Now, Mark, what does this tell you about how high-res audio is track-dependent?
It's pretty interesting. This one is actually somewhat compelling to me because I use Mosaic more often than I use any other track to demo. And I always get about a minute and a half into the piece because it's a fairly transparent track compared to the other two, meaning there's an acoustic bass player, Dominic Genova, and Steve Foreman plays percussion. And notable amongst some of the percussion instruments that he plays was a set of tuning pins ripped out of an old junked piano that formed a very high-frequency tingling sound people would be familiar with, made out of glass, but this one happened to be about a little tuning pins that are part of the junked piano that he tore up. And by the time you get there, it's just sonoluminescent is the only word that I can think of. When you hear that and knowing the clarity and the accuracy and the sort of, marvelous reproduction of metal, knowing that vinyl and analog tape and the rest of them suffer when you get up there with other complications, that's one that to really key on. I mean, I did the test myself, as you know, and I did it through a set of headphones sitting at my computer. And I wrote a blog post about it because I was a little bit shocked. At the end of my test, I missed all of them. I did the AVX thing, and I got 0 out of 5, which means I easily identified them. But I got them all right because I could tell them apart. So
in other words, you could hear a difference.
I could hear a difference.
You attributed that difference incorrectly every time.
Yeah. So maybe the creator here is suffering from being old and can't hear anymore, but I could tell them apart. The Mosaic one is really telling that way. The reason that I included the Wallace Roney track, the Just My Imagination, is because he, as you rightly point out, played the Harman mute. And I remember my engineer in this very room where I am coming in right after we pulled up those tracks after the recording, and he said, "You won't believe what's in this room." And sure enough, that Harman mute creates such a generous amount of ultrasonic information that Dominic, who's a much younger man than I am, could hear it and respond to it. On the other hand, then the Steve March Torme, the deck tet and vocal track, is a track that has tremendous dynamic range. I mean, there are moments where there's a rim shot or a complete stab of the entire, big band, so that you get a lot of sound at a very, very quick juncture. And part of the reason for giving you the whole tune is because it starts out quiet and then has these moments throughout. So if you were triggering more on frequency response, Mosaic would have been the one to listen to, although it's pretty dynamic as well. It's better than 90 dB. The Just My Imagination was more about the high frequency information. And finally, the Steve March, the Torme track, was about dynamic range. And it really hits it hard, especially if you listen to the last 30, 40 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. M5 in the chat room is asking a great question. Did I collect the age of the listeners? And the answer is no, I didn't. But in retrospect, I probably should have. And I did get, there were a number of people who did, in fact, tell me their age. And there were a few who said that they were in their 50s and maybe they couldn't hear anything above 12 kilohertz. And I think in at least one case there, I'm trying to find it now in my spreadsheets, there was a guy who got 100% correct while saying at the same time, I'm 54 and I can't hear anything above 12 kilohertz. Here's another guy. He says, 42 years old, male, working in an office, little lifetime exposure to loud rock concerts. Very important there, too, because if you have had, in your youth, went to a lot of loud rock concerts, you could very easily have noise-related hearing damage, and that can really significantly impair things. So this guy identified himself in that way, which I thought was very interesting. He, in fact, got 2 out of 3 correct. He missed 1. And in fact, it was just my imagination, which was the hardest one to get, according to those results that I just showed. So you're right. And in fact, some test in the future might very well need to include people's audiogram, essentially. have them get a recent audiogram at an audiologist or something and have them bring that in as well. Anyway, so there you have seen the results of the AVS AIX high resolution audio experiment to see whether or not people can hear a difference. And it seems that they can. And so the next question is, well, what conclusions can we draw from these results, if any? And again, since it's not scientific, we can't say for sure anything. But one possibility that I wanted to bring up here is that what people were hearing in the way of differences was in fact due to the sample rate conversion. We had to go through 2 sample rate conversions, remember. We had to take a copy of these high-res files, down convert them to CD specs resolution, and then re-up convert that. Now, Mark, you used this very high professional system to do that, which is known for being transparent. Sonic Solutions certainly is a very well-known professional company. But that might be a factor, don't you think?
It could be. I mean, absolutely. There's always going to be a tick here and there because we have to try and meet some of the requirements, such as keeping the files the same size and so forth. There were, likewise in the Meyer and Moran study, they were doing real-time conversion by having a recorder on, record and having it do a real-time sample rate conversion, which this is the one that I use is not a real-time sample rate conversion. It actually uses a lot more complex algorithm to do that kind of conversion. So who's to say that ultimately something that's that subtle would be the trigger? That's why I took some care. And when we look at the spectrograms, everything is virtually identical, even when you zoom in between the 44.1 and 96, up until that point where they diverge. Excuse me. So, I'm, especially in the world of audiophiles, where people claim that they can hear the difference between this power cord and that power cord, or this digital USB connection. I mean, come on, we're getting past that, I hope.
Well, there are differences, and then there are differences. I mean, there's a psychoacoustical phenomenon known as just noticeable difference, or JND. And if some difference falls below the JND for human beings, then they're not going to hear any difference. It's simply not going to register, even though there is technically, measurably, some tiny difference.
That's true. I mean, who's to say? If I get the chance to get the equipment both in here and run through 500 to 1,000 subjects, it's not an audiogram kind of hearing. Do you tell the difference? Can you not tell the difference? What got me kind of rolling on this was anecdotally back in the days. I spent 13, 16 years being a mastering engineer, working at 44.1 pretty much exclusively back when Sonic Solutions was new in my life. And I did records for the Bad Company and the Allman Brothers and things like that. I mean, it's been part of my career, and I did a lot of critical listening along the way. Plus, I'm a musician. You know, I've spent my life playing music and being around music, so it's something that I take some pride in. That I have pretty good hearing and tested really well. You know, at one of the AESs recently, and where the truck is parked in the back, said, "Yeah, you're hearing like 30-year-olds generally here," because I protect my ears rigorously through listening experiences as well. But the anecdotal story goes, well, you know, when I spend 8 hours mastering a record at 44.1, I definitely feel differently as a physiological experience than when I spend an entire day mixing or mastering, working on one of my own 96 kilohertz 24-bit recordings. I can't attribute it to anything, but it happened often enough so that I know that there was something to that I wanted to endorse and advocate for, and make sure that we had recordings that lived up to that spec. But in reality, when you get, and what I rail on a lot, we're not really dealing with format, sample rate, word length issues in the sort of degradation of the recorded experience that we have these days. It's far more the way that the records are made and processed, and the lack of care in maintaining dynamic range. The life is sucked out of an awful lot of the tracks that we listen to because of the commercial demands of being on YouTube or on the radio or put out via the traditional means of distribution, iTunes and CDs and so forth. That I think these tunes, my recordings in particular, but others do it as well, the purest type recording where you try and maintain that fidelity that matches real life or enhances, you know, the live experience, have a much better shot of reflecting that audiophile grade fidelity when you use higher sample rates and longer word lengths. Just makes the production more true to the experience. You know, it gets a little bit hairy when you get 192. There are people now talking 384, and I've even seen people talking 768 as a sample rate. It's certainly not for the frequencies where they're going to benefit, but, you know, maybe from the marketing dollars and so forth, it's worthwhile to have bigger numbers. But if we can get people in NARAS, if we can get the recording engineers and artists to really demand that the recordings be made with that kind of care and targeting fidelity, I think we will all be a lot further in taking advantage of the new technologies that we've got. And it's just spec sheets and saying, oh, great, it's good to 96 or 192 sample rate. That's going to make better audible, you know, fidelity for us. It's just not going to do that unless the raw material is there from the outset to take advantage of it.
I had to laugh there when you said the traditional means of distribution like iTunes. Because, you know, clearly that's relatively new, but it sort of feels traditional these days. Yeah, we're talking also about data compression, where like 90% of the content is actually removed. And we're also talking about dynamic range compression. Most pop music these days is compressed in the dynamic dimension, such that really there's only a few dB of difference between the softest and loudest parts of the music. And that's of concern as well.
There's an interesting, you bring that up. I got an email some months ago. I don't know if we have talked about it, but your listeners and viewers should check out the Harman-sponsored video piece that's part of the Grammy Museum downtown here in LA called "The Distortion of Sound," and in which Quincy and Slash and a bunch of other notables and some of the acousticians and researchers at Harman all contributed to why we've had this disconnect over these last generation or so of fidelity. I think we had better fidelity when I was in high school than we do now in terms of maintaining that dynamic range and so forth. But they got very confused about that very issue, not recognizing that, well, an MP3 file is a data reduction technique to make the files smaller and reside with a smaller footprint on your iPod or whatever, versus audio compression, which is happening in the studios, at the radio stations, at the mastering facilities, to reduce the dynamic range and make everything appear then louder. And some of the demonstrations that associate with that in that particular film are completely wrong. They're talking about, you know, a data compression and the suffering that tunes go through at MP3, and then the demonstrations they do are all about audio compression and flattening.
Dynamic compression, yeah.
So, and I've talked to the people out there. There's hopefully some recourse to fix some of the misperceptions that were presented in the film, because this lady, Kate Nash, at the end, she just pleads. She said, well, I always want the very best. Why aren't we getting the very best? Well, because you're not the end consultant when it comes to putting the stuff out on radio or YouTube or any other format. Is that the people that are running the show are the managers and the label executives and the producers, engineers, who say that record's not loud enough. Let's make it louder because it'll have that much more chance of being a hit.
And by louder, we really mean dynamic compression, because then the range of dynamics is very small, and you can crank it up and hear everything and not lose anything if it goes down too low.
That's right. Everybody loves loud.
Everybody loves loud. Logan 5 in the chat room has an interesting idea here, and it sort of leads into the final section of this discussion, which is, he says, you need a selection of, quote, super listeners who have virgin ears and no aging effects, which means young. Well, finding young people who haven't been exposed to loud music would be difficult. But it brings up, I think, a more fundamental issue, which is if we conduct these tests with very carefully selected listeners who are skilled, who have good hearing acuity, and so on and so forth, what will that tell us about the efficacy of high-resolution audio out in the wider world of music consumers?
It's going to be a real look. Still, the argument is: does this matter to the mass consumer? Let's say that it does pass the 50-50 test, and that audiophiles, these people that have the systems and care about listening to music with fidelity and have the experience to listen, can reliably identify a high-resolution file over a CD version. Okay, great. Does that translate to the person listening to their Beats headphones on a bus driving through San Francisco? Does it translate to somebody using their jam box at the beach? People in those categories, which is 98% of the audio listening that's done in this country, they don't care. They're not going to tell the difference. They're not going to invest in greater equipment to get that improved sound quality. So as a mass market, returning to the soul of music, as Neil Young would say, when you're delivering the same CD quality that we've had for years, is probably a non-starter. I think we need to advocate, as I was referring to earlier, to getting recordings made in possibly 2 SKUs. Let's put that version out that is the heavily compressed, data compressed, the heavily audio compressed, all loud all the time version. But then maybe there's another version that can be downloaded associated with that file off of a website that says, for those of you interested in something with greater dynamic range, for those of you interested in something that's presented differently, maybe it's a headphone mix or a 5.1 presentation, this one's for you, and see. And I think if we start doing that and have the comparison between A, B, that the shopping that people do will gravitate towards that which has greater dynamic range for those people that care about listening. And when I play something out of some of the high-resolution phone that I got from HTC and Sprint, and I play it just out of the headphone jack, people are amazed at, why does this sound so different than what I'm used to? It's not necessarily that the phone is capable of 9624. It's because the files actually have some of that fidelity built into them, when most of the files that you listen to don't. I sat there in front of my system at home this morning, just in the music section, checking out some albums. I hadn't heard a lot of some of the new stuff from the Counting Crows was out, and there was some Skrillex and the rest of them. And 99% of every one of the tracks that I heard was flatter than a pancake in terms of dynamic range. The loudness wars aren't over. In fact, I think we're just getting started in terms of the processing that's applied to files. So fidelity may be, suffering terminally at this point, but I think with the increase in downloads and the availability of more masters being made with fidelity, there's a shot at it. I certainly haven't given up yet, and the results of what you and I went through with this casual testing and evaluation is certainly encouraging to say, well, it wasn't a bust. It looks, in fact, indicates that somehow maybe there is something to this. But a lot further study needs to be done, obviously.
Absolutely right. Eric Duckman in the chat room makes a great point. which is, I don't care if kids can hear the difference. I care if I can hear the difference. And that's exactly right. And that was the point, really one of the main points of this experiment was you download these files, you listen on your system in your room, you tell me if you can hear a difference. Because what's important is, can you hear the difference, which will determine whether or not you want to spend the extra money on a more capable system or not.
True. I make available at realhd-audio.com. There's a prominent button on the front page of that website where I blog daily that says, here's some free files that if you have not had the chance to listen to files that are legitimately high resolution, they're not up conversions, they're not older recordings that have been tweaked into 96, 24-bit buckets. These are the real deal. I did a set with Sprint as well that are available through their website. But these are free files. All you have to do is write to me, and I will give you the credentials to go download the files and listen to. Mosaic, I know, is on there. Symphonic stuff is on there. If it matters, you'll hear it. But give it an honest listen. Go up and check those files out. And I checked. 25,000 people have actually downloaded these files to actually, getting into high-res music. I'd be curious to hear what your stuff is. And I get a lot of very positive comments back from people saying, I didn't realize that things would sound this way. Whether I attribute that to the sampling, the word length, as I said before, I think it has a lot to do with the way that we produce records. But, it is a slice of the overall music market, and I hope a bigger one as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if Neil Young, you mentioned Neil Young earlier, if he has his way, it'll be a bigger slice because, of course, he's promoting his Pono project, which is all about high-res audio, and this special portable player that's made by this company called AIR, A-Y-R-E, which is very well known in the audiophile circles to make high-quality audio circuitry. And I know that Neil is obviously a huge name, and if he's promoting it, I think it is going to get somewhat wider play.
Well, definitely the fact that you can hear on NPR or that you can read in the Wall Street Journal that Neil Young and Pono are making a splash. They raised a lot of money, $6.2 million, selling 18,000 of these Pono players back in the April timeframe, and they're back at it now with crowdfunding that has raised many millions more in fact than they got with the players. These Pono devices. Where I get disappointed is that he and I are at odds with what actually qualifies as a high-resolution file, because there was an announcement several weeks ago I wrote about where he and a British company called Omniphone are partnered up, and Omniphone will be providing the quote-unquote 35 million high-resolution files to back up the store. Well, the 35 million high-resolution files turn out to be ripped CDs. So, great, I can kick a field goal from the 20-yard line, maybe, that somebody else, in the pro NFL world would do at 50 yards. But if you move the goal line and say that everything is now high resolution audio, what's the differentiation? Why is anybody going to spend $25 or $30 for a file you can get at Walmart for 99 cents or $7 and rip it yourself? I really, I get my hackles up a little bit about people misrepresenting what is and what isn't high resolution audio. And you and I have talked about that before. It comes back to this provenance issue, but it's a little disillusioning when Neil and Pono are saying we've got this Ferrari, little device that Air and Charles Hanson have helped him build, and they're going to manufacture lots of, and I'm going to put low octane fuel in it, the same old thing we've always had.
Yes, indeed. F-Loop in the chat room is saying getting 44.1 kilohertz content for everybody is a good first step. Remember that we're mostly stuck with MP3s.
Yeah. And I think he hit it right on the head. The reality is the threshold that we're on when we, I think, erroneously call things high resolution is that we're not going to have lossy compression any longer, that you're going to get 44.1 CD quality, which can be absolutely fabulous if the productions are made with fidelity in mind, so much so that there's a service coming called Tidal that is headed in the fall to the United States that will be delivering, the same kind of streaming download quality as CDs. That's a first.
And now that we have bandwidth that can accommodate larger files and storage is really cheap, that certainly is a technological underpinning that would allow uncompressed, undata compressed audio files from being distributed in this way much more easily.
Especially if things like FLAC and some of the streaming services up their standard to 320 or the one that I mentioned a moment ago is 1411, which is actually CD bandwidth. Right. I'm a little dubious about some of that because I think the longer term, as I've written, is probably going to be a streaming service that is at CD quality or CD specification even, that will be just built into your cell phone as an add-on cost per month, and you'll be able to listen to any track, anytime, anywhere. Download the ones if you're out of cell service range, and pay another $10 or $20 a month for it. The service coming out of Scandinavia will be $20 a month. But why do I need to have that on a different device when HTC, Samsung, and some of the other phone manufacturers are providing great sounding DACs of premium quality right into the device that you do your texting, your emailing, and your phone calls on?
Yep, exactly. Well, in the last few minutes, I'd love to talk about what we might do next. This has been an interesting experiment, but of course, as I've said many times, it's not scientific. I know that you've mentioned earlier the ultimate experiment would be to put somebody in an MRI and play the music and see different resolutions of music. But barring that, for example, I think once you get the JBL M1s, are they? Those M2 speakers into your studio, you could potentially, bring a bunch of people in. It'd be a controlled environment. You could play them A and B and get them to write down their choices or whatever, or do an AVX or whatever, and have a bunch of people come through, many more than we've had, and play more different kinds of tracks and, develop something more scientific than what we've done here. As I wrote down in my notes as well, and somebody in the chat room mentioned it, we talked about it earlier, maybe they could bring along with them their audiogram just to make sure that they've got reasonable hearing. But another question I have for you is, would there be a different, perhaps better way to prepare the test files? As we talked about, it's possible that the sample rate conversion might have had something to do with the difference that people heard. We decided to do that in order to keep everything in the digital domain. And the other possibility we had thought about was taking the 2496 track and the 1644 one down converted version, convert them to analog, and then reconvert them back to digital both at 2496 using very high quality DACs and ADCs, analog to digital converters. But then people would have complained about that. So
yeah, I think we're flying under the radar on that stuff. I mean, certainly there is no ideal way, but we're certainly below the thresholds of being able to discern things based on the sample rate conversion. I'm convinced of that there's, we did have some issues with level matching, making sure that the process didn't degrade or attenuate one of the files and not the other. So we made some adjustments on that so that we figured out what was going on there. But it's, there will never be a perfect case. How close can we get? I think we can get within the margins close. I look forward to, and I'm hoping this room will be, sort of high-res central when I get it equipped and have Bob Hodis or somebody like that come in with their instrumentation microphones and validate that from this spot right back here, that coming into this space as a listener, you've got 96 kilohertz, 24 bits, and the frequency range of the audio is matching the ultimate quality. At least to decide once and for all whether this is a myth or whether it's a fact. Clearly, we haven't had that kind of test. The Meyer and Moran thing was a joke. A lot of the claims that people make, Monty over at Ziff, people quote me his stuff. He's right about a lot of things, but he's wrong about a lot of things as well, because he's focused on those commercially available recordings that we know fit within that 16-bit realm. There are some, and I think there need to be a whole lot more recordings that actually don't have the limitations that are hoisted on us by the commercial music industry. So there's room to learn. It's going to take some funding. It's going to take some time. But, over the course of the next couple of years, I'll invite lots of people in here, and including the students in my recording program and people with good ears and audiophiles to say, Does it matter? Does it make a difference to you? I haven't given up the ghost yet.
Well, I haven't either. And I think that this has been a very interesting experiment, and I really appreciate your helping with it and providing the tracks and doing the sample rate conversions and all that stuff. It was some amount of work there, which ended up, I think, yielding some interesting results that we can build upon and move forward to continue to explore this idea. Does it make a difference? Is it worth spending the extra money on the high-resolution audio than even on CD, and particularly MP3? I don't think there's any question about that. But it's a fascinating subject, and it's been a great experiment, and I thank you so very much for participating in it with me.
No, you're very welcome, Scott. At least we've been able to get to the first step and qualify material on the listening side, so that people will have something honestly to compare. Exactly so.
So there you have it. The results of our grand experiment, stage one, anyway, phase one. You can contact Mark on several websites. He has AIXrecords.com, which is his site for all of his recordings that he makes himself. There's iTrax, ITRAX.com, on which there are high fidelity, high resolution recordings of his own and also of others as well. And then you can read his blog, which he does every day, religiously, quite amazing, at realhd-audio.com. And I think there's a mirror site, hraplanet.com. HRA standing for high resolution audio. So bunch of places to find out more about what Mark's doing with high-res audio and what he thinks about it. And I do encourage you to check that out. You can always find me, of course, at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott, also at avsforum. And you can find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg, or our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Next week, or really the week after next, I will have returned from CEDIA, the big trade show where we're going to learn all sorts of things about Dolby Atmos and 4K projectors and all kinds of stuff like that. And I will be joined to talk about what we saw and heard by Mark Henninger, my cohort at AVS Forum, Michael Heiss, an industry consultant and a jolly good CEDIA fellow, and Tom Norton from soundandvision.com and Sound and Vision magazine. And the four of us will get deep into what we experienced at CEDIA. So I do hope you will join me for that. Until then, geek out.